I kept rehearsing the sentence in my head, polishing it into something clean enough to survive the air between my mouth and theirs. Not because I believed it would change anything, not because I thought I mattered, because the longer I didn't say it, the more it stopped being a sentence and started becoming a weight. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you tremble or sweat. It was quieter than it lived in the small pauses between ordinary, in the half-second when you lift your eyes and decide not to lift them all the way, in the way your tongue presses against your teeth like it's trying to stop itself from moving. I remember the taste of metal, like I'd bitten down too hard at some point and never let the blood show. I remember how even my breathing felt like it needed permission, as if drawing too deep a breath could be interpreted as disagreement. It sounds simple when people talk about it afterward. Why didn't you say something? Like words are coins you can toss without consequence. Like they don't land somewhere and stay there, marking you. But in that moment, words had shape. They had mass. They had a cost you could feel in your ribs. I had seen the mistake forming before anyone called it a mistake. Not as a dramatic revelation, not as a sudden flash of genius. More like noticing a crack in glass you're supposed to trust. Small at first, almost polite. Easy to ignore if you kept your eyes moving. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it wasn't my place to notice. That it was my imagination. That I was tired. That I didn't have the full picture. That there were people whose job it was to see these things. And if they hadn't reacted, then maybe there was nothing there. That's how it starts. Not with cowardice, not with surrender, but with a series of small courtesies you offer to authority. You let it keep its dignity. You let it keep its momentum. You let it keep being right. And each time you do, your warning becomes less like a warning and more like a private superstition. Something you carry around quietly, ashamed of how much you believe it. There were moments I almost spoke without meaning to. A breath would gather. A word would rise to the back of my throat. My body would lean forward the way it does when you're about to step into the street and then remember the traffic. And then something would stop me. Sometimes it was a sound, a laugh, short and dismissive, from someone who hadn't even heard my thought, but somehow still managed to crush it. Sometimes it was the way a room could go still without anyone asking it to. Sometimes it was the memory of what happens to people who make problems in places that cannot afford problems. Mostly, it was the look in other faces. Not anger, not even impatience. Something worse. Certainty. The kind that doesn't need you. The kind that makes your doubts feel like a personal defect. Like you're the only one missing whatever lesson everyone else learned. Like the fact that you're hesitating is proof you don't belong in the conversation at all. So I kept the sentence inside. I turned it over like a piece of contraband, hiding it from. I edited it. I softened it. I tried to make it sound less like an accusation and more like a question. Less like panic and more like procedure. I tried to make it harmless. And the more harmless I made it, the more it started to feel pointless to say. Because a warning that doesn't disturb anything is barely a warning at all. It's just sound. There was also the other thought. The one I didn't like admitting even to myself. What if I spoke and I was wrong? Not wrong in a way that could be corrected, but wrong in a way that would follow me. Wrong in a way that would turn my name into a small joke. Wrong in a way that would make every future silence look like wisdom, compared to this one moment of unnecessary alarm. That possibility haunted me almost as much as the one I couldn't stop seeing. So I did what people do when they are afraid of both out. I waited for someone else to say it first. I waited for a louder voice, a braver mouth. Someone with the right to be concerned, someone whose concern would be interpreted as leadership instead of weak. The waiting felt almost responsible. It felt disciplined. It felt like restraint. It was nothing like that. It was avoidance dressed up as patience. It was self-preservation pretending to be professionalism. It was the oldest trick fear knows. Just a little longer. Just a few more minutes. Just until the right moment. Just until someone asks. Just until it becomes absolutely undeniable. And there's a comfort, a false comfort. Because as long as you're waiting, you can pretend you haven't chosen yet. But the body knows. The body always knows. Each time the chance opened, even slightly, I felt my muscles tighten as if preparing for impact. My jaw would set. My throat would close around the unsaid sentence like it was something alive trying to get out. And I would swallow it back down. Not dramatically. Not with tears. Not with some noble agony. With a small motion no one noticed. With the same practiced control I used for everything else. By the time I understood that the moment was already passing, my silence had started to feel like a decision, and by the time I could have forced the words out anyway, it felt like I'd already agreed. So I stood there, calm on the outside, and let the warning stay where it was. Behind my teeth, unspoken, chosen. The place itself did most of the talking, even when no one spoke. It was built for repetition, for days that looked like the day before them. For movements so familiar they stopped feeling like choices. You woke when you were told. You stood where you were told. You listened longer than you spoke. The air carried the smell of oil and paper, and something older that never quite washed out, no matter how often the floors were scrubbed. Nothing about it invited opinion. The hierarchy was visible in small, ordinary, in who stood when someone entered, in who stopped talking mid-sentence without being asked, in the way certain chairs were never used unless someone specific was present, and how no one ever questioned why. Authority didn't need to announce itself. It lived in posture, in tone, in the unspoken understanding that some voices were meant to travel upward, and others were meant to absorb what came down. I belonged to the second kind, close enough to hear things early, close enough to understand the weight behind certain phrases, the implications buried inside neutral language, close enough to recognize when something had been framed to sound inevitable rather than debatable, but never close enough to interrupt. The days were structured around briefings and confirmations. Information moved in one direction, questions in another. If something was unclear, you learned how to phrase your confusion, so it sounded like a request for clarification rather than doubt. Even then, you learned quickly which questions were welcome, and which ones earned a pause that felt like a warning. No one ever said don't question this. They didn't have to. You could feel it in the way a room reacted when someone came too close to the edges of what had already been decided. A subtle tightening, a shift in attention, a silence that wasn't empty but crowded with unspoken corrections. Those moments taught you where the invisible lines were. I learned them well. I learned that certainty was prized above accuracy, that decisiveness mattered more than hesitation, even when hesitation came from knowledge, that the appearance of control was sometimes treated as control itself. Mistakes were discussed only after they had finished happening. Before that, they were just possibilities, and possibilities were dangerous things to acknowledge. They slowed momentum, they complicated schedules, they suggested vulnerability, and vulnerability was something you were expected to manage privately. The people above me carried themselves with confidence that bordered on calm indifference. They spoke in complete sentences, rarely revising them. When they disagreed, it was done quietly, behind closed doors, and only after confirming that the disagreement wouldn't disturb the larger shape of things. Once something reached the table where final words were spoken, it had already been filtered, refined, stripped of doubts that might distract from execution. That was the system. Not cruel, not careless. Efficient. And efficiency leaves little room for hesitation from the wrong mouth. I watched how others navigated it. Those who survived longest learned to anticipate what was expected before it was said. They learned to offer support instead of suggestions, agreement instead of alternatives, solutions that fit inside the existing framework rather than challenged it. The ones who didn't learn that lesson were remembered briefly, usually as examples, not of failure, but of poor judgment, of lacking perspective, of misunderstanding how things worked. No one needed to spell it out. You understood that raising concerns at the wrong time didn't mark you as courageous. It marked you as disruptive, as unreliable, as someone who couldn't be trusted to stay in their lane when pressure increased. And pressure was always increasing. There was always a reason not to slow down, a deadline, a window, a sequence that couldn't be adjusted without consequences no one wanted to imagine out loud. So the atmosphere encouraged forward motion by default. You could feel it in the pace of conversations, in how quickly doubts were redirected into action items, in how silence was interpreted as consent. When decisions were discussed, they were framed as conclusions rather than choices. Language mattered. Words like necessary, expected, within parameters did a lot of work. They smoothed over the rough edges where questions might have taken hold. And if someone did hesitate, even briefly, the reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A raised eyebrow, a short pause, a reminder of the larger picture. It was never hostile. That was the most effective part. It made resistance feel unnecessary, immature, like insisting on stopping a machine that was already running smoothly. I knew where I stood in all of this. I was there to observe, to record, to assist, to make sure information arrived intact, not altered by interpretation or emotion. My role wasn't to shape decisions, only to support them once they were made. At least, that was how it was defined. And definitions are powerful things. They tell you who you're allowed to be in a They tell you when your instincts are valuable and when they're an inconvenience. So when I noticed the flaw, when the shape of it became clear enough that I couldn't unsee it, I also understood something else immediately. Saying it out loud would mean stepping outside the shape drawn for me. It would mean changing how people saw me, not just in that moment, but afterward. It would mean attaching my voice to a disruption, to a pause, to a possibility everyone else was working hard not to consider. And in a place like that, being remembered for the wrong reason could be as dangerous as being wrong. I told myself there were safeguards. That if something truly serious was at risk, it would be caught higher up. That layers existed for a reason. That systems this large didn't rely on one quiet person noticing something and speaking up in the perfect moment. That belief was comforting. It allowed me to keep doing my job without feeling like I was failing at something else. Around me, routines continued. Equipment was checked. Reports were signed. Conversations drifted toward logistics and timing, toward what needed to happen next. Everything moved forward with the steady confidence of a plan that had already been accepted as real. And I moved with it, not because I agreed with it, but because the structure around me made disagreement feel like a personal indulgence. Something you could afford only if you had earned the right to slow things down. I hadn't, so I listened. I memorized details. I noted patterns. I kept my face neutral and my posture still. And each time the flaw surfaced again, each time it pressed against my awareness like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I reminded myself of where I was and who I was not. The environment did the rest. It didn't force my silence. It made it feel appropriate. Once I started noticing it, I couldn't stop. The flaw didn't announce itself. It returned quietly, in fragments. In the way certain assumptions were repeated without being re-examined. In how numbers were accepted because they had been accepted before. In the way language smoothed over uncertainty until it sounded like confidence. Each time it surfaced, my first instinct was to correct it silently, to adjust it in my head, to imagine how it might be compensated for elsewhere, how margins might absorb it, how reality might bend just enough to avoid proving me right. I became very good at that kind of thinking. It was easier than admitting what it really was, a point where the structure depended on something fragile pretending to be solid. I argued with myself constantly, though no one could see it. I told myself I was overestimating the risk, that I was focusing too narrowly, missing the broader view, that my position gave me proximity but not authority, and that authority carried information I didn't have access to. That was one of my favorite excuses. You don't know enough. It sounded responsible, humble even. But the more I repeated it, the less convincing it became. Because what I was seeing didn't require privileged insight. It didn't rely on secret knowledge or classified context. It relied on basic observation, on patterns repeating in ways they shouldn't, on small inconsistencies lining up too neatly to be coincidence. There were moments when the thought came fully formed, sharp and undeniable. This is going to fail. Not catastrophically, not dramatically, at least not in the way people imagine failure, but in a way that would cascade, in a way that would make every later explanation sound thin. Each time that thought appeared, I pushed it away as quickly as I could. I told myself that certainty was dangerous, that assuming failure could become a self-fulfilling distraction, that doubt, once voiced, had a way of spreading beyond its original shape. I reminded myself of my role, of my distance from the center of decision, of how easily concern could be mistaken for panic when it came from the wrong source. But the thought didn't leave. It followed me into quiet moments. It lingered during pauses in conversation, during the seconds when no one was speaking and everyone seemed to be listening to something else entirely. Sometimes, someone would say something that brushed against it without naming it, a phrase that stopped just short of acknowledgement, a half-question quickly reframed into agreement. In those moments, my chest would tighten. I would feel the sentence rise again, faster this time, less polished. This was it, I would think. This is where you say it. I imagined the words leaving my mouth. I imagined the room reacting, not with outrage, but with that careful professional stillness that meant something had gone wrong socially, even if no one said so. I imagined the silence afterward, the way eyes would shift, the way attention would recalibrate around the disruption. I imagined someone responding, not angrily but firmly, reassuringly, explaining why I was mistaken without explicitly saying so, thanking me for my input before setting it aside. That imagined exchange played in my head again and again, until it felt rehearsed, until the outcome felt predetermined. There was also the darker version, the one where my concern was interpreted as something else entirely, as lack of confidence, as inability to handle pressure, as misunderstanding the stakes. I imagined being remembered not for being right or wrong, but for having spoken at the wrong time, for having slowed things down unnecessarily, for having introduced doubt where resolve was required. In that version, nothing changed except how I was seen. That possibility frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I valued approval, but because visibility is dangerous when you don't control the narrative around it. Once your voice enters the room, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It gets interpreted, summarized, repeated. It becomes a label. I told myself I was protecting the work by staying silent, that the system functioned best without interruptions from those not tasked with steering it. that my doubts were a private burden, not a public responsibility. That last thought was the most seductive. It's not your responsibility. It let me breathe easier. It let me frame my hesitation as discipline rather than fear. It let me believe that silence was a form of respect, not avoidance. But even as I leaned on that belief, something else kept pressing back. A quieter voice, harder to silence than the rehearsed excuses. It didn't argue. It didn't dramatize. It simply observed. It reminded me that I was there when others weren't. That I had heard things in sequence, not summary. That I had noticed timing and phrasing and omissions that wouldn't be visible later, once everything was compressed into reports and outcome. It reminded me that awareness, once gained, doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. There were moments when my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A breath taken too sharply, a hand tightening around a pen, a shift in posture that almost carried me forward. Each time, I caught myself. I learned to keep my face still, to nod at the right moments, to let my silence blend seamlessly with everyone else's. I became very careful about where I looked, very aware of where my attention rested. I didn't want anyone to notice the way my focus lingered on certain details, certain phrases, certain gaps. I told myself that speaking too early could be worse than not speaking at all, that timing mattered, that there would be a clearer moment later when the concern would sound less speculative and more necessary. That moment never quite arrived. Instead, the pressure increased. Deadlines approached, conversations narrowed. The space for reconsideration grew smaller with each confirmation, and with every step forward, the cost of speaking grew heavier, because the later you interrupt, the more you threaten. Not just a decision, but the confidence built around it. Not just an assumption, but the authority that allowed it to stand unchallenged for so long. I understood that intuitively. By then, my silence was no longer passive. It was active maintenance, a careful balancing act between what I knew and what I allowed myself to acknowledge. I carried the warning everywhere, but I kept it folded small, and the longer I did, the more it began to feel like part of me, not a sentence waiting to be spoken, but something already swallowed. The moment didn't arrive with ceremony. There was no pause designed for reflection, no clearing of the throat, no dramatic shift in tone. It came folded into routine, delivered the same way everything else had been done, calmly, efficiently, as if the shape of it had always been inevitable. I remember the exact second when I understood what was happening, not because someone announced it, but because the language changed, subtly. A conditional became an assumption. A possibility hardened into intention. A sequence that had once been discussed as flexible was spoken aloud as fixed. The room didn't react. That was what frightened me most. Pens moved, pages turned. Someone adjusted their chair. Someone else nodded, already thinking ahead to execution. The machinery of agreement engaged without friction, as if the decision had been waiting patiently for permission to exist. And there it was. The flaw, no longer theoretical, no longer something that might be compensated for later. It was now part of the structure itself, locked in by timing and expectation. This was the moment. I felt it before I thought it. A tightening just below the sternum, sharp enough to interrupt my breath. My body leaned forward a fraction of an inch, the way it does when you misjudge the distance to the ground. My mouth opened. Not enough for anyone to notice, not enough for sound to escape, just enough for air to rush in. Cold and sudden, filling a space that should have held words. The sentence was there, fully formed now. No longer edited, no longer softened. Clear, direct, dangerous. If I spoke it, everything would stop. Not permanently, not dramatically, but long enough to acknowledge what had just been set in motion. Long enough to introduce doubt into a room that had already moved past it. I could feel the weight of that interruption. The way it would hang in the air, demanding attention, demanding response. And I could feel the weight of what would come after. Eyes would turn, not all at once, but gradually, as awareness spread that something had shifted, that someone had broken the rhythm, that a voice not meant to redirect the flow had done so anyway. I imagined the brief silence, the recalibration, the careful consideration of how to respond without conceding too much. I imagined the outcome where nothing changed except the memory of my voice speaking at the wrong time. My throat tightened. It wasn't panic. It was restraint, honed by habit. The same restraint that kept my hands still when tension rose. The same restraint that had earned me trust precisely because it never disrupted anything. I felt it clamped down now, firm and familiar. The sentence pressed upward anyway, insistent. It felt physical, like trying to hold back a cough in a quiet room. Like suppressing a reflex your body insists is necessary. My jaw locked. The decision continued without me. Words passed between others, confirming details, aligning expectations. Each phrase felt like another door closing, another chance slipping quietly out of reach. I was aware of my heartbeat in a way that felt almost intrusive. Too loud. Too fast. I worried, irrationally, that someone might hear it. I focused on breathing shallowly, evenly, the way you do when you're trying not to draw attention to yourself. This is still possible, I told myself. You can still speak. But the thought no longer felt true. The longer I waited, the more my silence thickened. It wasn't absence, and it was presence. A choice accumulating weight with every second that I realized then that speaking now would no longer sound like caution. It would sound like contradiction, and contradiction, in that moment, would not be received as help. My hands were cold. I pressed my fingers together under the table, hard enough to ground myself in the sensation. The pressure hurt slightly, and I welcomed it. It gave me something to focus on that wasn't the sentence clawing at my throat. Someone summarized the decision. There it was, spoken cleanly, without hesitation, framed as the logical conclusion of everything that had come before. The summary ended. There was a pause. Not an invitation, just a natural break before moving on. That was the final opening. I felt the silence stretch, thin and fragile. If I spoke now, it would tear. My chest burned with the effort of holding still, and then I did something small, almost imperceptible. I swallowed. The motion was reflexive, but it carried meaning. The sentence went down with it, forced back into the dark space it had been fighting to escape. My mouth closed. The pause ended. Conversation resumed. The moment passed. No one looked at me. No one noticed anything had almost happened. The decision moved forward, intact and unquestioned, carried along by momentum and mutual confidence. And I sat there, my body rigid, my pulse slowly returning to something like normal, acutely aware of the absence I had created. Not the absence of sound, the absence of resistance. In that instant, silence stopped being something that surrounded me. It became something I had done. And once done, it could not be undone. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came the way I had feared they would, quietly, incrementally, disguised as minor complications. Small adjustments were made, explanations were offered. Nothing dramatic enough to demand alarm, nothing definitive enough to force reconsideration. At first, it was easy to tell myself this was normal, that no plan ever unfolded cleanly, that friction was expected, that the early signs I noticed were simply the cost of movement, not evidence of failure. But I recognized the pattern. Each deviation traced the same invisible line I had seen from the beginning. Each correction bent around the same fragile assumption, stretching it thinner without ever naming it. The structure held, but only because it was being reinforced constantly, quietly, by people compensating for something they still didn't see, or didn't want to. I watched as conversations changed tone, as confidence softened into explanation, as certainty gave way to careful phrasing that avoided blame without admitting error. No one spoke about the decision itself. They spoke around it. They treated the emerging problems as isolated, unrelated, unfortunate. Each one was addressed on its own, neatly contained, as if acknowledging their connection would give them more power than they deserved. I knew better, because the shape of it matched the warning I had swallowed. When the first clear confirmation arrived, it wasn't public. It wasn't announced. It passed through my hands as data, as a report, as something meant to be processed and forwarded without commentary. I remember staring at it longer than necessary, my eyes following the numbers again and again, hoping, absurdly, that I had misread them. I hadn't. The room felt smaller then, even though nothing had changed physically. The air seemed heavier, as if the space itself was aware of what had been proven. I felt no relief. That surprised me. I had imagined that being right, even silently, would offer some sense of validation, that knowing my instincts had been accurate might soften the weight of having stayed quiet. It didn't. It made it worse, because now the fear I had carried privately was no longer hypothetical. It was real, unfolding, irreversible. And with it came a different kind of responsibility, one I had already failed. As more evidence accumulated, the adjustments grew more desperate. Timelines were revised. Expectations were recalibrated. People worked longer hours, spoke in lower voices, avoided eye contact more often. The system strained, but it did not stop. That, too, was familiar. I watched others sense that something was wrong without being able to articulate. I saw frustration take the place of confidence, exhaustion replace certainty, and still, no one questioned the original decision. It had already been absorbed into the narrative. To challenge it now would require unraveling too much. It would mean admitting not just an error, but a chain of them. It would mean confronting how easily momentum had overridden caution. So the consequences were managed, not confronted. Each day brought another quiet confirmation. Another moment where the cost became harder to ignore but still too diffuse to name outright. And with each one, the sentence I had buried grew heavier inside me. I started to notice how often my mind returned to that moment, not in a dramatic way, not with replayed dialogue or imagined heroics, just a simple, persistent awareness. This is where it began. The guilt didn't announce itself loudly either. It settled in slowly, like a pressure that never fully lifted. It accompanied me through routine tasks, through ordinary conversations. It sat just beneath the surface of everything, waiting. Sometimes, I caught myself watching others react to the unfolding situation, and I wondered, briefly, shamefully, whether it would have been different if they knew someone had seen this coming. Not if they knew I had known, just if they knew someone had. That thought passed quickly, replaced by something more honest and more painful. It no longer mattered. The point where words could have altered the course had already been left behind. Whatever influence my warning might have had was tied to a moment that no longer existed. Now, there was only response, damage control, endurance. I began to understand something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Silence doesn't end when the decision is made. It extends forward. It becomes part of the outcome, part of the history, an invisible factor that shapes how events unfold and how they are later understood. I carried that knowledge with me as the consequences continued to accumulate, each one confirming not just the flaw in the decision, but the cost of having protected myself from. Nothing about the aftermath felt sudden. That was the cruelest part. It felt exactly like what I had seen coming, and there was nothing left to do but watch it happen, knowing that my silence had not spared me from consequence. It had simply delayed the moment when I would have to live with it. I still think about it in moments when nothing else is demanding my attention, not because I want to, and not because I believe there is anything left to understand. It comes back the way certain sounds do after they've stopped, an echo that no longer belongs to the original noise, but to the space it left behind. Time has passed. Enough that the urgency has faded from the surface of things. Enough that what happened has been folded into records, summaries, conclusions written in careful language. Enough that people speak about it now with distance, as if distance itself explains something. It doesn't. What remains for me is not the event, but the moment before it. Not the outcome, but the choice that never became visible. Memory doesn't replay it as a scene. There are no sharp images, no dramatic return to that. Instead, it surfaces as sensation. The pressure in my chest, the dryness in my mouth, the precise weight of a sentence held too long. Sometimes I wake with the feeling that I am still swallowing. I have learned that guilt is not loud. It doesn't demand confession or punishment. It doesn't even accuse you directly. It simply waits. Patient, persistent, content to sit beside you while you live the rest of your life. It doesn't ask why didn't you speak. It asks how easily you didn't. That question follows me more closely than any detail of what came after. Because it has nothing to do with fear in the abstract, or authority, or context. It has to do with how quickly I adapted to silence, how natural it felt once I committed to it. I sometimes try to imagine an alternate version of myself, the one who spoke. Not a hero, not a savior, just someone who disrupted the flow long enough to introduce doubt. Someone who accepted whatever came with that interruption and lived with it instead. That version feels distant, almost fictional. Not because it required courage I didn't have, but because it required a willingness to be seen in a way I avoided. The truth is harder to accept. I didn't stay silent because I was ordered to. I stayed silent because I understood the cost of speaking, and I decided it was too high. That understanding hasn't softened with time. If anything, it has sharpened. I see now how easily systems absorb quiet compliance, how they depend on it, how many outcomes are shaped not just by decisions made, but by objections withheld, how history is written around what was said, leaving no space to account for what was swallowed. I know that my silence did not cause everything that followed, but I also know it became part of it. That is the part no one records. No report includes a section for unvoiced warnings. No timeline marks the moment when a mouth closed instead of opening. Silence leaves no physical evidence. It cannot be cross-examined or disproven. It survives intact. Sometimes when people talk about the past with certainty, I wonder what they would hear if silence could speak. Not in explanations or excuses, but in simple admissions. I noticed. I hesitated. I chose myself. Those are not words anyone ever asked me to say. They are words I live with instead. I have told myself many times that speaking later would have changed nothing, that by the time consequences were visible, the shape of events was already fixed, that my warning, delivered after the fact, would have sounded like justification rather than caution. That may even be true, but it misses the point, because the weight I carry has never been about outcome. It has been about the knowledge that when a moment existed that required something small, something human, I withheld it, not out of malice, not out of indifference, out of restraint that felt reasonable at the time. I understand now that silence does not fade. It doesn't dissolve with time or context or explanation. It doesn't lose its shape. It stays exactly as it was when it was chosen. A closed mouth, an unbroken rhythm, a warning that never left.